So we are going to start this morning on epithelial tissue. Okay, so remember, epithelium is a covering or a lining. So it'd be like your skin. And it also lines open body cavities. So like your digestive cavity, like your mouth, your respiratory, like your nose, the urogenital tracts, those are all lined with epithelium. And then also it's covering the ventral body cavity. So remember we talked about how we have these serous membranes. They're made of epithelial tissue. We also have epithelium that occurs in our glands. So we call that glandular epithelium. So we'll talk about that just a little bit as well. We'll probably talk a little bit more about glands in the next chapter, chapter 5. We'll get into the skin and we'll start talking about organ systems in chapter 5, where we'll talk more about our glands then. All right, so before we go into different kinds of epithelial tissue in the body, I do want to walk you through, in general, these are characteristics that all epithelial tissue has. So whether we're looking at your skin or what's lining your mouth, all epithelial tissue always has these particular characteristics. So the very first one is that it's cellular. That just means that it has a ton of cells inside of it. There's not a lot of other stuff in epithelial tissues. When you look at epithelium under a microscope, it just looks like cell next to cell, next to cell, next to cell. So we say that its cells are very closely packed and there is very little extracellular material. Extracellular is exactly what it sounds like it is. Extra meaning other stuff. So there isn't much stuff outside the cells. The other characteristic is that it has a polarity. And that means that there's always going to be a surface that's free, that's nothing is attached to. And then there is a surface where it is attached to something else. And so I'm going to give you an example of like your skin, right? This part of my skin that I am touching, this would be the free surface, right? There's nothing attached out here. This is open. But if I were to take a pin and stick it through my skin, or a needle, eventually I'd go from epithelial tissue into another kind of tissue. Where it's connected to the other tissue, that's the attached surface. Okay, so epithelium always has a free surface and an attached surface. The apical surface is the free surface. The basal surface is the attached surface. A lot of times the cells on the apical surface, the free surface, will look a little different than the ones that are on the attached surface. Apical surface cells, a lot of times they can just be smooth. So let me see if I can pull up just a whiteboard and y'all can look at that. Okay. So on the apical surface, sometimes we might have cells that just look like this. So I'm going to draw some epithelial tissue with my mad drawing skills. I took art in college. Like, I was pretty good. You would never know today. So what we're looking at here is this would be my epithelial tissue at the top. You can see all those cells. And then down here where I drew these lines, this would be a different kind of tissue. So I'm going to say that, let me do this in a different color. Up here at the top, this is my apical surface, right? So all of this up here, that's the free surface. It's not connected to anything else. But then if we go down here, this part down in here, that would be the basal surface, right? That's where it's attached to another tissue. Now you can see from this drawing, the apical surface cells are nice and smooth at the top. And sometimes we'll have that. Sometimes we'll have apical cells where we have little hairs on the surface called cilia. So I'm going to do the same drawing. And this time I'm going to have little cilia on the surface. Now, the function of cilia is they can actually help to propel things like mucus across the surface. So we have a lot of cilia lining the respiratory tract. It helps to move our dirty mucus out of the body. Okay, so sometimes we'll have cilia. And then sometimes we'll also have structures called microvilli. So the surface cells, the apical surface cells, have these sort of indentations, these little invaginations. Okay, so you can see at the very top, those little invaginations, those are called microvilli. And the function of microvilli is they actually increase the surface area. So think about it this way. If I have an area from here to here and I have a string that's nice and straight, then you can see that it covers, you know, that 2 inches right there. But if I have the same 2 inches, but instead I take that string and I go like this, well, I have a much greater surface area, don't I? Because if I were to stretch that string out, it's not just 2 inches, it's really 4, right? And that's what microvilli do, is they actually help to increase the surface area. And that is fantastic when we're looking at things like lining the intestines. Lining the small intestine, you have a lot of microvilli because in your small intestine, you're absorbing nutrients. So we want a greater surface area so we can do a better job of absorbing nutrients out of our food. So let me go back to our PowerPoint. I didn't know it would take me back to where we started. All right. And so we just walked through some of some of these different things that we can find on the surface of our epithelial cells. Another thing that all epithelial cells have in common is they all have special contacts holding them together. So they all have either things like tight junctions. Tight junctions are exactly what they sound like. So where you have the cells, they're held together very tightly. We can also have something called desmosomes. That's this picture in the middle, where you have 2 cells and they're held together by some linker proteins that let the cells kind of move a little bit. Or you have something called gap junctions. And gap junctions have a little gap between them so that you create a channel between the 2 cells and they can send signals back and forth to each other. So epithelial cells always have special contacts. Another characteristic of all epithelium is that it always has to have support underneath. So under the basal surface cells, you will always have something called a basement membrane. That one should be really easy to remember because if you think of a basement, you find the basement in the bottom of the house. So if we look at this image on the left over here, we can see that's our epithelial cells. You can see they're real tall epithelial cells. And that blue line right there, that is the basement membrane. You have to have something on the basal surface supporting those epithelial cells. Okay. Now the basement membrane you can see from the image in the middle, it has different layers to it. You don't have to worry about that. I'm not going to ask you about that. You just need to know about the basement membrane. And then the last couple of characteristics, number 5, it is avascular. Anytime you see this qualifier A in front of something, it means not. So epithelial tissue is not vascular. It does not have a blood supply, but it is innervative. So it does have nerves. So you might be thinking, well, when I cut my skin, it bleeds. So there has to be a blood supply. Have you ever gotten a paper cut where it doesn't bleed, but it hurts like the dickens? So that is showing you that your epithelial tissue is avascular. There's no blood supply, but it has a great nerve supply to it. Now, if you have cut yourself deep enough that you're bleeding, then you have actually cut down into another type of tissue that does have a blood supply. Okay, but epithelium does not have a blood supply. It gets its nutrients from diffusion. So I'm going to go back to this picture. So the underlying tissue, like this tissue down in here, this has a blood supply. And so the nutrients would naturally just diffuse up into your epithelial tissue cells because cells are living and they have to get nutrients. And then one of the last ones is that epithelium has a really high regeneration capacity. So what that means is that if you cut your epithelial tissue, if you destroy the apical surface or the basal surface, it will get replaced very fast as long as you have adequate nutrition. So this is why you get a paper cut, and usually the next day your body's already sealed it, right? You don't even notice it was there anymore. An example of when you might not have adequate nutrition, great example would be a burn. Think like a third-degree burn. A third-degree burn goes through all three layers of your skin, your epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. And when it goes through all three layers, it basically cauterizes your blood vessels. And so you're not getting nutrients, you're not getting a blood supply or nutrients out to your skin anymore. And in that case, that's when a lot of people with a third-degree burn have to have a tissue graft. So they have to have skin from somewhere else in their body put in that area. And then a lot of times they have to have a wound vac put on, where it's sort of like, it'd be like if I burned my arm, they would kind of wrap it, it looks like cellophane, and pull a vacuum on it. They're trying to pull the nutrients from deep inside your body out to the skin so it'll regenerate, okay? All right, so those are just very general characteristics of all epithelial tissue. It has a high regeneration capacity, has an apical and a basal surface, it has certain connections, has a lot of cells in it. So this is, no matter what epithelium we're looking at, that's what we're gonna see. Now for epithelial tissue, I will tell you, I think this is the easiest type of tissue to name and describe, because all you have to do is be descriptive and you got the name of it. So it always has two names. The first name is the number of layers that you're looking at. So simple just means that there's only one cell layer. Stratified means more than one. The second name in epithelial tissue will tell you the shape of the cells. So if the cells are squamous in shape, think flat. Okay, these are flat shaped cells. And then cuboidal is cube shaped, columnar column shaped. Okay. So here's a great example. We can see the image at the top. This would be, we would call this a simple epithelium, right? You can see there is just one cell layer right there, one cell layer thick. The one at the bottom you can see is a stratified epithelium because it's multiple cell layers thick. Now let's do the second name. The second name is the shape of the cells. So that picture at the top, what is the shape of those cells? Are they column, cubed, or squamous?
Squamous.
Yeah, so these are simple squamous. So we would say this is a simple squamous epithelial tissue. And then the ones at the bottom, this one gets a little tricky. When you're looking at something stratified, you can see that the shape of the cell down at the bottom versus the shapes of the cells at the top look a little different, right? They're a little more cubed at the bottom than they are at the top. You will always name a stratified epithelium based on the shape at the top. So based on the shape at the apical surface. So we would say this is a stratified squamous epithelial tissue, right? Because these are flat at the top. Okay, so we're naming them based on the shape at the apical surface. This is just showing you some different shapes. So we've got squamous, cuboidal, columnar. The only one that can sometimes get a little complicated is squamous. I always think of squamous cells as like dinner plates. You know, if you look at a dinner plate from the side, it looks really flat. But if you take that dinner plate and sort of rotate it, it's going to look a little more round, right? So squamous can appear a little different depending on how the tissue was sectioned before it was mounted on a slide. But cuboidal is always cubed and columnar is always column shaped. So before we go through our different kinds of epithelial tissue, I want to walk you through the function of your epithelial tissues. There are two main functions, and the function is based on the structure of the tissue. So we always say if it is a simple epithelium, right, if it is one cell layer thick, then its function, because it's really thin, is going to be absorbing. It can absorb nutrients really well, or secreting, or filtering. So a simple epithelium, a skinny, thin epithelium, one cell layer thick, its function is always absorption, secretion, filtration. If it's a thick, stratified epithelium, its main function is always going to be protection. Protection from abrasion, protection from wear and tear. So what kind of epithelial tissue do you think is in your skin? Is it simple or stratified?
Stratified.
Yeah,
Stratified.
stratified. So it's going to be stratified. It's going to have multiple layers because it's there for protection. Okay. So keep that in mind. I'm going to star this slide. This is really helpful, especially when you're taking an exam. I'll ask you a couple of questions about functions of tissues, especially epithelial tissues. So if you just remember these two things, you'll get all those questions correct. Definitely star this one and remember that. All right, so we're going to walk through our epithelial tissues. We're going to do simple epithelium, so all the different kinds of simple, and then we'll do our stratified. So we'll start with simple. This is simple squamous is the first one we'll do. This is one layer of very flat-shaped cells. And the function, remember, it is simple epithelium. So the function is always going to be absorption, filtration, secretion, always. A lot of times we can find simple squamous inside the body. And when it's inside the body, instead of calling it epithelium, you might see in your book, you might see it called endothelium. And the reason for that, epi means above or on top. So when we talk about your skin, for example, we would call it epithelial tissue. But if it's inside the body, instead of calling it epithelium, a lot of times we call it endothelium. Okay, I don't do that. I think that just is very confusing. So I won't be doing that. But just so you know, if you're reading your textbook, you might see that term. So where do we find a simple squamous epithelial tissue? Something really thin, one cell layer thick, very flat cells. We're going to find it all over the place. We might find it in places like the lungs. So the alveoli of your lungs, little air sacs in your lungs. Think about it. When you breathe in, that air goes into the alveoli, and from the alveoli, it has to diffuse out into your bloodstream. So having this really nice, thin, simple squamous epithelial tissue around the alveoli is great for being able to move gases back and forth. Okay, so that's just one example. So here it is in this image. You can see the alveoli of the lungs. And what you're looking at, so you can see, let me see if I can use a different color here so you can see better. I'm going to draw a black line right here. What I'm drawing on is that simple squamous epithelial tissue. You can see how thin it is. So this right here, this sort of center part, this is not a cell. This is actually the air sac. So your oxygen goes in here when you breathe. And from there, it's going to diffuse out into your bloodstream. So you can see there are some little capillaries in here, like here's a capillary, okay? And so you can actually see like the little nuclei of all that simple squamous epithelial cells. So those are those really flat shaped cells. Okay. Oh, it didn't like that for some reason. There we go. Ooh, let's see if I can erase that. Nope, hang on. I tried something new. There we go. All right. So another one is simple cuboidal. Simple cuboidal is one single layer of cube-shaped cells. So the nuclei are a little bit bigger since the cell is bigger. Again, it's simple epithelium. So the function is absorption, secretion, filtration. We're going to find this in places like you'll find it in kidneys. You might find it in some of your small glands. You might find it on the surface of the ovaries. This is showing you in the kidneys. Okay, so you can see the kidneys here. And here is our simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to draw right here. You can see my red line. Okay, that would be the basal surface of those cells. So there's my basement membrane. And then in white, right in the middle, I'm going to write an L. Okay, that white in the middle, we call it a lumen. That's the opening. And so that would be the apical surface of those cells. And you can see all those cells, they're very cube-shaped cells, and you can see the nuclei in there. So this is simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. All right, and then the last one is simple columnar. Simple columnar is one layer of column-shaped cells. A lot of times you'll see some cilia on the surface. And remember, cilia are like little tiny hairs, and they help to move things through internal passageways. So we're going to find ciliated types in the respiratory tract, like in your bronchi, helping to move mucus. We're going to find ciliated types in the fallopian tubes. What would the cilia be moving in the fallopian tubes? It's the egg, right? So when the ovaries release the egg, it's got to move down the fallopian tubes. So the cilia can help propel that egg through the fallopian tubes. And same thing in the uterus. Non-ciliated forms might be in like your digestive tract and your gallbladder, where you have muscle that is moving food. So cilia is really tiny, it's microscopic. It's not going to do a good job of moving big stuff like food, but it can do a good job of moving things like cells, like the egg through a fallopian tube, or even kind of propelling mucus that's lining a respiratory tract. Again, it's still simple. So the function is still absorption, secretion, filtration. One type of cell that we'll find a lot of times if we're looking at ciliated versions of this tissue is a goblet cell. We'll talk way more about this cell in the next chapter, but this is a cell that makes mucus. It secretes mucus. Okay, so this is an example here. This is from the intestines. And so this is going to be simple columnar epithelium. You can see that there is no cilia here. And I'll draw in red right here. This would be the basement membrane. So that's the basal surface where those cells are connected to the basement membrane. This right here would be the apical surface of the cell. Okay, and then we can do the same thing on the other side. Here's the apical surface. And then down here would be the basal surface because there's our basement membrane. So the food would be moving through right here. Okay, so that's just basically looking at the intestines up close. And now you can see those cells are very cube-shaped cells. They have a big old nucleus in them. Okay, so that is one layer of cube-shaped cells. So simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay, so we have done simple squamous. Let's flip back to our picture. Simple squamous, very, very, very flat cells around here. We have done simple cuboidal, one layer of cube-shaped cells, and simple columnar, one layer of column-shaped cells. Now, there is one more type of simple epithelium that I want to walk you through called pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Pseudo, this prefix pseudo means false, right? So pseudostratified means it's falsely stratified. So it might look like it's more than one layer, but it's not. It's only one layer. And the reason it looks like it's more than one layer is because the cells have slightly different heights to them. So it makes it look like they're more than one layer. The nuclei end up being at different heights. So it looks like more than one layer. But in reality, all the cells are attached at the basal surface, okay? Because it is not stratified, that means it's still simple. So it is still a single layer of cells. So the function is still absorption, secretion, filtration. And its big job is moving mucus. So you might find this in the respiratory tract. You also might find this in places like the vas deferens in a male. This carries the sperm in men. So this is an image of that. So this is in the respiratory tract. And so what we're looking at here, I'm going to draw my line here. This is my basement membrane. So that's the basal surface. Okay, up here, that's that white part, that's our free surface. So this is the apical surface at the top. And now you can see at the apical surface all these little cilia up here. Again, they do a great job of moving mucus. But you can kind of see when you look at this why this looks like it might be more than one layer, because you can see the nuclei. They're all at different heights. Every one of these cells is actually connected to the basement membrane. So it gives it this sort of falsely stratified appearance. This image over here on the left is a really good one because it's just showing you how it is still only one layer. The cells are just different heights. So you might be thinking, okay, so this one looks like it's stratified, but it's not stratified. So how would I know if it is really stratified versus if it's fake stratified, right? Pseudostratified. So that's the next one I'm going to walk you through. But before I walk you through the characteristics of a stratified epithelium, I'm going to show you a picture of it. So if we look at this image, this is a stratified epithelium. So you can see all of this is all epithelial tissue. Anything that's in that red is epithelial tissue. And you can definitely see how this one is stratified. You can see those nuclei all over, and you can tell that it's more than one cell layer thick. So stratified always will look like this. Pseudostratified looks more like this, okay? So for a stratified epithelium, it is more than one cell layer thick. It's usually a nice thick tissue. Cells on the apical surface are always squamous. They are always flat. Cells below the apical surface can be more cuboidal or columnar in shape. And remember, it's stratified, so its function is protection from abrasion and wear and tear. Now, a lot of times we'll find keratinized stratified epithelium. Keratin is a really hard, protective, waterproof protein. We find it in our hair. We find the same protein that's even harder in our nails, okay? And so sometimes we'll find the keratinized layers in parts of our epidermis, but areas that are not keratinized, places where you would not need that waterproofing. You don't need waterproofing like in your mouth and your esophagus and in the vagina, right? You don't need the keratin there. So those would have non-keratinized cells. They don't need the waterproof protein. Now, if we think about this bottom bullet and all the places we're finding stratified epithelium, right? We have it in our skin. It's there for protection. We have it lining our mouth. It's there for protection, right? We don't all eat applesauce and baby food every day. My son's favorite cereal right now, I feel like such a bad mom. He's getting like Cinnamon Toast Crunch and Captain Crunch, but his favorite is Captain Crunch, which that was my favorite as a kid too. But dang, it will tear your mouth up. It is like eating glass. You have to let it get all soggy in your milk first. And so it is so important. You know, we eat hot food. We eat food that can really abrade the lining of our mouth. So we have to have a stratified epithelial tissue in our mouth. And then same thing with the vagina, right? We have to have protection from wear and tear, protection from abrasion. So here is that picture of our stratified epithelial tissue. Again, you can see at the surface, like you can tell, it's hard to see the individual cells, but you can definitely see the nuclei, and you can tell the nuclei are very flat. So that's how we know it's squamous, right? This is our apical surface up here. It's white, it's free, there's nothing attached. Down here is our basal surface, right? That's that area that's attached. Now, there's just a few other epithelial tissues I'll mention. One of them is called transitional epithelium. This one gets its name because it actually has an appearance that varies. It varies on the distension of the organ. So we're going to find transitional epithelium in organs that will stretch up as they fill. So a great example of that is going to be in the urinary tract. So like the bladder, as the bladder fills, think of a balloon, blowing up a balloon, it's going to stretch. And so what we'll find is that when the bladder is empty, the epithelial lining in there is actually pretty thick. It's about 6 cell layers thick. The cells that are on the apical surface have sort of a bubbled shape to them. They have a dome shape. But as the bladder fills up with urine, it's going to stretch out. Think of a balloon, right? If you get like a navy balloon, latex balloon, when it is deflated, the latex is really thick and it almost looks black. And then as you start blowing the balloon up, as the latex thins out, then you can start to see the color, right? You can see the navy color. It's kind of the same here with the bladder, right? In this transitional epithelium. It's really thick when it's empty, but as it stretches, as it fills, it's going to stretch and get thinner. So it'll go down to about 3 cell layers thick, and the dome shape of the cells on the apical surface will go away. They'll become more flat. Okay, so this is a great picture. We can see, again, I'll draw that line. There's my basal surface, okay, attached to the basement membrane. At the top is my apical surface. Okay, look at the cells on the apical surface here. They are definitely bubbled. They are domed. So is that bladder empty or full? It is empty. So it's nice and thick, got a really thick transitional epithelium here, and the cells on the apical surface are bubbled up, they're dome shaped, so we know it's an empty bladder. If the bladder were to fill, those cells on the apical surface would stretch out and they would get more flat. All right, now we've walked through all of our different types of epithelium. And again, you know, I think if we just kind of scroll back through these images, all you have to do, it has 2 names, and all you have to do is just be descriptive, right? So if we look here, this is stratified squamous. It's more than 1 cell layer thick. Cells at the surface are flat, stratified squamous. This one is pseudostratified. Okay, that one doesn't really follow the rules there. This one is simple columnar, 1 cell layer thick, column shaped. Simple cuboidal, 1 cell layer thick, cube shaped. And simple squamous, 1 cell layer thick, flat. So these are really easy, I think. Just be descriptive and you'll be able to identify the type of tissue. Now remember, epithelium is not only a covering or a lining, but it also makes the glands of the body. And glands are just cells that secrete an aqueous fluid or a secretion. So we have different glands in the body. We have glands that secrete internally, and we call these glands endocrine glands. Okay, internally secreting, because remember, endo means inside. Then we also have exocrine glands. And these are externally secreting. So this would be things like sweat glands and oil glands, salivary glands, anything that's secreting out of the body. Endocrine glands, I am not going to spend a huge amount of time on these in this chapter. We have an entire chapter at the end of the semester, chapter 16, where we will focus on the endocrine system. Endocrine glands are the glands in the body that secrete hormones. So they're releasing right into your bloodstream. They're releasing hormones and other regulatory chemicals. Now, a lot of times we'll call endocrine glands ductless glands. And that's because if you think about it, like think if we have a sweat gland, right? Here's the surface of my skin. Here's a sweat gland. When I sweat, it's going to come out onto the surface of the body, and it's coming out through this duct, right? That would be an exocrine gland. Well, when we're talking about an endocrine gland, it isn't releasing onto the surface of anything. It's going straight into your bloodstream. So it doesn't need to have a duct. So that's why we call them ductless glands. These are going to secrete their products right into your bloodstream or into lymphatic fluid so it can travel throughout the body and go to its target organ. And from there, it's going to elicit some type of response. So a good example, and the way I always think of your endocrine glands is they are essentially how your organs can communicate with each other. So you have some endocrine glands that are found in your intestines. And when food gets into your intestines, those glands secrete hormones that can travel to other organs like the pancreas and tell the pancreas to release enzymes into the intestines to help you digest your food. So it's truly how the intestines and the pancreas can communicate with each other is through hormones. And so having the endocrine system and talking about these hormones, again, this is something that we'll really focus on when we get to chapter 16. For this chapter, for our purposes, we're going to focus a little more on exocrine glands. And I mentioned we'll talk about them here, but we'll also talk about them in chapter 5 when we do the skin. These are way more numerous than endocrine glands, and they're secreting their products straight onto the surface of the body or into open body cavities. So this would be things like mucus, sweat glands, oil glands, salivary glands. All of these are going out onto the surface of the body or an open cavity like your mouth or your nose. Now we have different kinds of exocrine glands. We have unicellular. Remember, uni means one. So this is a single cell that releases its products. So an example would be a goblet cell, and I'll show you a picture of that. We also have multicellular exocrine glands. Multi just means many. So this is a gland that has lots of cells in it. So let's do our unicellular gland first, a goblet cell. First of all, if we look at the picture down here, we can tell that this is one single cell because it has one single nucleus, right? And so this cell you can see in green right here. This cell is creating mucus, and it's storing the mucus in these little green vesicles. And those little vesicles rise to the surface of the cell and pop, and they release their products. Okay, so this goblet cell is releasing mucus into the respiratory tract or into your intestines. So it is a single cell. Now we also have multicellular glands that can be classified based on their function. Or, if we think about function, what we're talking about here is their mode of secretion, so how they're secreting. So we have two kinds of multicellular glands that you need to be familiar with. One is a merocrine gland. A merocrine gland is going to be a multicellular gland that secretes its products through exocytosis. So I'm going to show you a picture of a merocrine gland. Okay, so we are looking over here on the left, right? This is a merocrine gland. First of all, if we look at this picture, we can see there's many cells here making up this gland. So we know it's multicellular. This gland, all the cells are making the product, storing it in vesicles, very similar to a goblet cell, releasing those products through exocytosis, and then the products can move out up through the duct and onto the surface of the body. Okay, that's a merocrine gland. So examples of merocrine glands would be like sweat glands. Sweat glands are merocrine glands. So these cells would be producing sweat, storing it in vesicles, then releasing it through exocytosis. It's coming out onto the surface of the body. Okay, so sweat glands are examples of that. The other kind of multicellular gland is called a holocrine gland. This one is very different. So its function is very different. The functions of these two exocrine glands are very different. A holocrine gland is this one over here on the right. And again, you can see it's a multicellular gland. You can see all the cells in here. But a holocrine gland, the cells within this gland will accumulate the products until the cell gets so big that the whole cell bursts open. So the way I remember holocrine is I remember holocrine, whole cell, hollow, whole. So the whole cell is bursting open at the top. Now they're trying to show you at this bottom image down here, they're trying to show you mitosis, because the cells at the very bottom of this gland are constantly going through mitosis, making new cells to replace the ones that have died at the top because they've ruptured. okay? So a holocrine gland, an example of this would be like an oil gland. So what is coming out of an oil gland isn't just oil, but it's also going to be all these cell fragments, right? All these parts and pieces. And this is why we always have issues with our oil glands. This is why the ducts of our oil glands can get clogged. This is why we have issues, because it's not just the product coming out, it's also all the other stuff. Okay, and we're going to talk way more about our oil glands and our sweat glands in the next chapter. Okay, but you do need to know for sure the difference between a merocrine and a holocrine gland.